Hi. Today I'm going to be talking about rent increases. Now, I've been asked by landlords and letting agents alike recently how to increase the rent, or can they increase the rent? And the most common question is there a limit on increasing the rent? So let's start with the first question. No, there's no limit on how much you can increase a rent. Obviously, you have to make sure the tenant can afford it. That's going to be the most important thing, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But no, there's no cap on how much you can increase the rent. So if you wish to increase the rent by £500 or £1,000 a month, there's nothing stopping you doing that, other than, of course, your tenant may not be able to afford it. Now, I always advise landlords and letting agents, when they're looking to increase rent, the most important thing to do is make sure your tenant can pay the additional top up. So would you carry out a normal affordability check? Absolutely. The same as you would if they were a new tenant coming to you and you wanted to check if they could afford the rent for the first time. We don't know what happens to a tenant's lifestyle within the 6 months or 12 months of a tenancy. Things can change, and especially with the increase in fuel bills, petrol prices, and obviously national insurance, people's purses really are taking a cut. So before you make that rent increase, and I totally understand why all landlords are doing a rent increase, make sure your tenant can afford it. Otherwise you could find yourself with rent arrears from your tenant, and then obviously the cost and the lengthy stress that comes with the court process, and nobody wants that realistically. Now, how to increase rent is the most important. Now, if you've got a tenant who is in a fixed term tenancy agreement, you can't increase the rent unless you've got written agreement with them that they are happy to change the terms of their agreement, and there's special forms that you need to complete to do that. It is a bit of an admin task, and realistically, unless there's some dramatic reason why you need to increase the rent during a fixed term, I'd strongly advise against it and waiting until you have the available time to do it. Now, if your tenant is outside of their fixed term, or the fixed term is coming to an end, you can increase the rent, and you can do this by a number of reasons, a number of ways. You can do it by serving a Section 13 notice. This is a standard form that you send out to the tenants, giving a minimum of 1 month's notice to the rent increase. If you've got a continuation clause and a rent increase clause in your fixed term, when it comes to an end, you can send the tenant a letter rather than the Section 13 notice. This outlines again 1 month's notice for the rent increase. Now, the one thing that people are getting a little confused about is you cannot increase the rent whenever you wish. You can only increase a rent once every year. So once every 365 days, you can increase the rent. Now, it's not tied into tenancy term. So if you've got a fixed term coming to its 6-month end, unless you issue a new tenancy agreement with the increased rent that the tenant has agreed, you can't just increase the rent because you're within that first year period. Now, there are some alternatives to this. If you want to increase the rent after 6 months and your tenant agrees, you would need to fill out a form and just some information between you and the tenant signed that basically waives both of your rights under Section 13, so that the landlord and tenant agree that all the rights are out of the window and the rent increase applies. Once you've got all this in writing, signed by you and the tenant, the rent increase would apply. Now, when you do a rent increase, Section 13 or the 1 month letter notice, the tenant does have the right to appeal a rent increase. Now, they can do that up to and including the date before the new rent is due to take effect, and they would apply to the first tier tribunal for them to basically assess whether they think the rent increase is fair or not. Now, this is usually done in front of a panel. They'll look at other properties in the area. You'll be allowed to submit evidence, the tenant will submit evidence, and then at the hearing the rent will be assessed and a written decision will be made. Whatever that decision says is gospel, basically. If the panel decide that the rent increase is fine, they'll set it at the rent increase. If they think it's too high, they may set it at a lower level. If they think the original rent was too high, they may take it down even further. So it's worth bearing in mind when you're increasing rent that there is a first tier tribunal that the tenants can access for free that may make the decision for you. Now, how do you increase the rent? Do you just pluck a figure out of thin air, or do you calculate it into your net yield, your own expenses? How do we work out how much we're going to charge in rent? So most people, and common practice, is we look at the rental property index. So what we're looking at there is to look at the prices for the rental properties in that area, same type and same tenure, see what the rent price was 2 months ago, and then we usually look at the rent increase in line with that. Some people say a rent increase is reasonable at 3 or 5%. Other people say differently. It all matters really where you're going with your business and what your strategy is. So, but again, as I say, the most important thing when it comes to rent increases is make sure your tenant can afford it. So rent increases done yearly are more manageable, rather than leaving a tenant in a property for maybe 2, 3, 5 years and then doing a big jump rent increase. That's not going to be manageable for people. So make sure you're putting your rents up every year if you want to put your rents up at small manageable increments. That way the rent increases for the tenants aren't too dramatic. They're expecting them every year and it's more manageable for them and their finances moving forward. If you've got any questions about rent increases, leave them in the comments and I will come back to you as soon as I can. Thank you.